It had been years since anyone had stepped foot in the old Meadow Lane playground. The once vibrant place of laughter and life now stood as a forgotten relic, swallowed by time and nature. Rusted swings creaked in the wind, their chains groaning under the strain of nothing but air. The slide, once polished and gleaming, was now caked with rust and grime. Weeds clawed their way through the cracks in the pavement, their tendrils wrapping around the base of a merry-go-round that hadn't spun in decades. The playground's eerie stillness was matched only by the stories whispered among the townsfolk of Stillwater. They called it the Sinister Playground, claiming it was haunted by the laughter of ghostly children who lured the living to their doom. Most dismissed the tales as mere legend, the product of small-town superstition. But not everyone in Stillwater was so skeptical. The Harris family had just moved to Stillwater. Dan and Lisa Harris, along with their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, were seeking a fresh start after a tumultuous few years. They'd found a cozy house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods and wide-open fields. It was quaint and quiet, everything they'd hoped for. Emily, with her chestnut curls and boundless energy, had taken to exploring the area every chance she got. Her parents, happy to see her adjusting, encouraged her curiosity. Still, Dan had warned her to stay away from the old playground. Why? Emily had asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. Dan hesitated, searching for the right words. It's just not safe, he said finally. It's old, broken down. You could get hurt. Emily had nodded, but the glint of curiosity in her eyes told another story. It was late one night, just a week after they'd moved in, when Emily first heard it. She sat up in bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. The sound was faint but unmistakable, laughter. First she thought it was a dream, the kind of dream that clings to the edges of reality, blurring the line between waking and sleeping. But as she strained to listen, the laughter came again, carried on the cool night breeze that drifted through her open window. She crept to the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Beyond the fence, in the distance, she saw it, the silhouette of the playground. The laughter seemed to float from that direction, light and playful, yet tinged with something she couldn't quite place. A chill ran down her spine, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Did you hear anything last night? Emily asked at breakfast, her voice casual but probing. Lisa glanced up from her coffee. Hear what, sweetie? Laughing, Emily said. Like kids playing. Dan's hand froze mid-reach for the butter. His eyes flicked to Lisa, then to Emily. What time was this? Late, Emily said, shrugging. It was coming from the playground. Dan's face darkened. I told you not to go near that place. I didn't go, Emily protested, her cheeks flushing. Lisa placed a hand on Dan's arm. It's probably just the wind, she said softly, though her tone carried an edge of uncertainty. By lunchtime, Emily's resolve had hardened. She didn't understand why her parents were so worried about the playground. It was just a bunch of old swings and slides. How dangerous could it really be? That afternoon, while Dan was fixing a leaky faucet and Lisa was sorting through unpacked boxes, Emily slipped out of the house. She didn't head straight for the playground, not at first. She took her time, wandering through the woods, enjoying the crunch of leaves underfoot and the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. But as she drew closer to the edge of the woods, the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, cooler. The chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness. And then, faint but unmistakable, came the laughter. Emily froze. The sound was closer now, louder. It was light and airy, like children playing a game. But there was something wrong about it, something that made her stomach twist. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The trees parted, and there it was, the playground. Emily approached cautiously, her sneakers crunching on the gravel path. The laughter had stopped, leaving only the whisper of the wind through the rusted chains. She could feel her pulse in her ears as she took in the scene before her. The swings swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The merry-go-round creaked, its metal frame groaning as it moved ever so slightly. The slide, covered in patches of rust, seemed to glisten faintly in the dappled sunlight. And then she saw it. A small figure darted behind the slide, quick, barely more than a blur. "Hello!" Emily called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't afraid. It was probably just another kid. Someone from town who liked to explore. Emily's scream tore through the stillness of the abandoned playground, scattering birds from the nearby trees. She stumbled backward, her wide eyes fixed on the silhouette at the top of the slide. The shadow didn't move, but the eerie, disembodied laughter echoed around her. A sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Her heart hammered in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, kicking up gravel. She didn't wait to see what the shadow would do next. Spinning around, she sprinted back toward the safety of the woods, her feet barely touching the ground. By the time Emily burst through the back door of her house, she was gasping for breath, her face flushed. She leaned against the wall, trying to calm her racing heart. "Emily," her mother's voice called from the kitchen. Emily froze, her mind racing. She couldn't tell her parents what she'd seen. They wouldn't believe her. Worse, they'd probably scold her for going to the playground after they'd told her not to. "Yeah," she managed to reply, her voice trembling despite her best effort. "Lunch is ready. Come wash up." Emily took a moment to collect herself, then walked into the kitchen. Lisa glanced at her daughter, noting the flush in her cheeks and the slight tremble in her hands. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked, concern flickering in her eyes. "Yeah," Emily lied, forcing a smile. "I was just running around outside." Lisa didn't press further, but something about Emily's demeanor stayed with her. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The shadow's image was burned into her mind. The way it had turned its head, the unnatural stillness of its body. It wasn't human. Couldn't be. The laughter still echoed in her ears, taunting her. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against her window, made her flinch. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't sleep. The next morning, Dan decided to take a walk through the woods. He needed some fresh air, a break from the constant unpacking and fixing up of their new home. As he wandered, he found himself nearing the edge of the woods where the playground stood. He hadn't been there since they'd moved in, but now, curiosity tugged at him. He stepped closer, pushing aside the branches that obscured his view. The playground looked as he remembered it, dilapidated and overgrown. But something caught his eye, footprints in the dirt. Dan frowned and stepped closer, crouching to examine them. The prints were small, barefoot, and fresh. His chest tightened as a wave of unease washed over him. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the playground. The swings moved gently in the breeze. The merry-go-round tilted slightly as though it had been used recently. A chill ran down his spine. He turned and walked briskly back toward the house, his mind racing. At breakfast, Dan couldn't shake the image of those footprints. He watched Emily as she picked at her cereal, her usual chatter replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. "Emily," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. "Did you go to the playground yesterday?" Emily froze, her spoon hovering above her bowl. She avoided his gaze, her face turning crimson. I just wanted to see it," she admitted quietly. Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told you not to go there. It's dangerous." "I didn't get hurt," Emily said quickly. "I just looked around. That's all." Dan hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her, but he needed her to understand the seriousness of the situation. "Emily, that place isn't safe," he said. "There's a reason people stay away from it. If you hear anything strange or see anything unusual, you need to tell us." "Promise me." Emily nodded, her eyes wide. "I promise." But she didn't tell him about the shadow. Later that afternoon, as Dan was running errands in town, he stopped by the local hardware store. While browsing the aisles, he struck up a conversation with the store owner, an older man named Joe. "You're the one who moved into the old Richards place, right?" Joe asked, leaning on the counter. "That's right," Dan said. "It's a nice spot. Quiet." Joe chuckled, a sound that lacked humor. Quiet can be deceiving around here. Dan frowned. What do you mean? Joe's expression darkened. You've heard the stories about the playground, haven't you? Dan hesitated. A little. Just local legends, right? Joe shook his head. Legends start somewhere. People say they've heard laughter coming from that place at night, seen shadows moving when there shouldn't be anyone there. And kids, he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the counter. What about kids? Dan pressed, his stomach tightening. Joe looked up, his eyes somber. They disappear. Always the ones who don't listen to their parents, the curious ones. They're drawn to it like moths to a flame. And once they go in, they don't come out. Dan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. That's just a story, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Joe shrugged. Believe what you want. Just keep your little girl away from that place. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily found herself unable to resist the pull of the playground. The shadow, the laughter, the strange energy. It called to her, a whisper in the back of her mind that she couldn't ignore. She slipped out of the house just as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. This time, the walk through the woods felt different. The air was heavy, the trees casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to reach for her as she passed. When she reached the edge of the woods, she paused. The playground stood before her, bathed in the dim light of dusk. It was silent now, the swings and slides still as statues. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. Hello, she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. She approached the sandbox, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of movement. That's when she saw it. A small red ball, half buried in the sand. It was clean, as though it had been placed there recently. Emily knelt down, reaching for the ball. A shadow fell over her. Her breath caught as she looked up. Standing at the edge of the sandbox was a figure. A child no older than she was. Its face was obscured by shadow, its features indistinct. Do you want to play? The figure asked, its voice soft and hollow. Emily opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. And then the laughter returned, louder than ever, surrounding her as the figure stepped closer. Emily's knees locked as the shadowy figure at the edge of the sandbox inched closer. The hollow, childlike voice hung in the air, almost playful. Yet something about it was horribly wrong. Do you want to play? It repeated, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. Emily stumbled backward, her small hands gripping the red ball tightly. Her breath came in ragged gasps as her mind screamed at her to run. But her legs refused to obey, as if the ground beneath her had turned to quicksand. The figure took another step forward. Its face, still shrouded in darkness, seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a pebble. I have to go, Emily stammered, her voice barely audible. The figure paused. Then, slowly, it extended a hand, pale and thin, its fingers too long and ending in sharp, blackened tips. Play with us, it whispered. Behind her, the merry-go-round creaked, and the swings began to sway violently, their rusted chains shrieking with every motion. Emily turned and bolted, the red ball slipping from her grasp. She ran blindly, branches tearing at her arms and legs as she plunged through the woods. The laughter chased her, echoing all around, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside her head. Emily burst through the back door of her house, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Emily? Lisa's voice came from the living room, tinged with concern. What on earth? Lisa stopped as she saw her daughter's pale, tear-streaked face. Sweetheart, what happened? Emily shook her head, unable to form words. She was trembling, her legs weak beneath her. Lisa rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight embrace. It's okay. It's okay, Lisa murmured, stroking Emily's hair. Dan appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. What's going on? Lisa glanced at him, worry etched on her face. I don't know. Emily, were you at the playground? Emily hesitated, her wide eyes darting between her parents. She wanted to tell them everything. The shadow, the voice, the laughter. but the words caught in her throat. "I just got scared," she whispered instead. Dan crouched down, his hands on her shoulders. "Emily, if you ever see or hear something strange, you need to tell us. No matter what. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, though the knot of fear in her chest remained. Later that night, after Emily had been tucked into bed, Lisa and Dan sat at the kitchen table, their voices hushed. She was terrified, Lisa said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I've never seen her like that." Dan nodded, his jaw tight. "I don't like this, Lisa. That playground. Joe told me some things today. About kids disappearing." Lisa's eyes widened. "Do you think?" "I don't know," Dan admitted. "But we need to keep her away from there. I don't care if it sounds crazy. Something about that place isn't right." Upstairs, Emily tossed and turned. Her dreams were vivid and strange. A swirling fog, a hollow voice calling her name, laughter that seemed to come from all directions. When she woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, she noticed a dull ache in her arm. Groggily, she turned on her bedside lamp and pulled up her sleeve. Her heart stopped. Etched into the pale skin of her forearm was a faint, dark mark. It looked like the outline of a small handprint, too perfect and precise to be an accident. The next morning, Dan woke early, determined to find answers. He couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Joe or the fear in Emily's eyes. Leaving Lisa and Emily still asleep, he drove back into town and parked outside the library. It was an old, imposing building with stone steps worn smooth by years of use. Inside, the musty scent of aged paper filled the air. Dan approached the librarian, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Excuse me," he said, clearing his throat. "I'm looking for information about the Meadow Lane playground." The woman's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Why? My daughter. She's curious about it," Dan lied. "I just want to know its history." The librarian hesitated, then nodded. "There's not much in the archives, but what we do have is unsettling." She led him to a dusty corner of the library, where she pulled out an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local children missing. Playground closed indefinitely." Dan scanned the article, his stomach sinking with each word. In the summer of 1978, 3 children vanished near Meadow Lane Playground. Witnesses reported hearing laughter late at night, but no evidence was ever found. The playground was closed and abandoned shortly after. Locals claim the area is cursed, and many refuse to speak of it to this day. Dan flipped to another page, where a grainy photograph showed the faces of the missing children. His blood ran cold. One of the children in the photo had the same hollow eyes and eerie smile as the shadow he'd seen in his own nightmares. While Dan was at the library, Emily sat in her room, staring at the mark on her arm. She had hidden it under a long-sleeved shirt, afraid of what her parents would say if they saw it. But she couldn't ignore the strange pull she felt, the same pull that had drawn her to the playground in the first place. As the hours passed, her curiosity grew stronger than her fear. She grabbed her sketchpad and began to draw. The lines came easily, as if her hand had a mind of its own. She sketched the playground, the swings swaying, the merry-go-round tilting, and in the center of it all, she drew the shadowy figure, its hand outstretched. When she finished, she stared at the drawing, her stomach churning. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to look back at her, as though it could see through the paper. A faint sound broke the silence. Laughter, distant but unmistakable. Emily's head snapped up. She moved to the window and peered out, her heart pounding. Far in the distance, near the edge of the woods, she saw the red ball she'd dropped. It was sitting perfectly still in the middle of the yard. Emily knew she should run to her parents, but the pull was stronger now, almost unbearable. Without thinking, she slipped on her shoes and crept outside. The yard was eerily quiet, the only sound her own breathing. She approached the ball cautiously, every instinct telling her to turn back. When she bent down to pick it up, a cold wind rushed past her, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Emily!" She froze, clutching the ball tightly. Slowly, She turned toward the woods. The shadow was there, standing just beyond the tree line. "Play with us," it whispered. Emily took a step back, but her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled. The ball slipped from her hands and rolled toward the shadow, stopping at its feet. The laughter rose again, loud and piercing, as the shadow began to move toward her. The shadow advanced, slow and deliberate, as Emily scrambled backward on hands and knees. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and every instinct screamed for her to run. The laughter grew louder, joined now by a chorus of faint whispers. They seemed to be coming from the woods themselves, weaving together in an eerie melody. "Emily," the whispers cooed, stretching her name like a taunt. She turned and bolted toward the house, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the crunch of her footsteps. The red ball remained where it had stopped, the shadow standing motionless beside it as if watching her retreat. She didn't dare look back. When Emily burst through the back door, Dan was already home, seated at the kitchen table with Lisa. His face was pale, and a stack of old papers lay spread out in front of him. "What happened?" Lisa asked, rushing to Emily's side as the girl doubled over, panting. Emily hesitated. She wanted to tell them everything. The whispers, the shadow, the laughter that wouldn't leave her mind, but something stopped her. A strange, suffocating fear, as though speaking the truth would make everything worse. "I tripped in the yard," she said weakly. Lisa frowned, glancing at Dan. He got up, kneeling to meet Emily's gaze. "Sweetheart, you've been acting strange since we moved here. Is something going on? You can tell us." Emily bit her lip and shook her head. Dan hesitated, then sighed. "Okay," he said gently. "But if something's wrong, you have to promise to let us know." Emily nodded, but her hand instinctively tugged at her sleeve, hiding the faint handprint on her arm. Later that night, after Emily was tucked in, Dan stayed up in the living room, poring over the documents he'd brought from the library. Lisa joined him, a steaming mug of tea in hand. "What are you doing?" she asked softly, glancing at the yellowed newspaper clippings spread across the coffee table. Dan rubbed his face, exhaustion tugging at him. Looking into the playground, Lisa sat beside him, her brow furrowing as she picked up one of the articles. "These are about missing children." "Yeah," Dan said grimly. 3 of them disappeared back in the late 70s. All of them were last seen near the Meadow Lane playground. Lisa's eyes scanned the page, and a chill ran through her. "What happened to them?" "They were never found," Dan replied, his voice low. "And that's not all. There are other stories more recent. People hear things. Laughter, voices, and some claim to have seen shadows moving where no one should be." Lisa shivered. "Do you think?" Dan hesitated. "I don't know. But whatever's going on, I'm keeping Emily away from that place." That night, Emily was plagued by nightmares. In her dream, she stood in the center of the playground, surrounded by swirling fog. The equipment loomed around her, twisted and distorted, as if it were alive. The shadowy figure appeared before her, joined by others. They were children, or at least they had been. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and empty, and their smiles stretched too wide. "Play with us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. Emily backed away, but the fog wrapped around her ankles, pulling her closer. The laughter returned, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. When she woke, she was drenched in sweat, her sheets tangled around her legs. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 3:12 a.m. The mark on her arm throbbed faintly. The following day, Dan decided to confront Joe at the hardware store. The older man was restocking shelves when Dan approached, his expression tense. "Joe, I need to know more about the playground, the stories, everything." Joe sighed, setting down a box of nails. "You don't want to dig too deep, Dan. Some things are better left alone." "My daughter's been acting strange," Dan said. "She's scared, and I think it's connected to that place." Joe studied him for a moment, then motioned for Dan to follow him to the back room. He pulled out an old ledger and flipped through its pages until he found what he was looking for. "This," Joe said, pointing to a faded entry. 1978. The summer those kids went missing. Dan leaned in, reading the scrawled notes. It wasn't just the children who had disappeared. Several adults who had gone searching for them were never seen again. The only clue left behind was a series of strange symbols carved into the ground near the playground. "What are these symbols?" Dan asked, his pulse quickening. Joe shook his head. "No one knows. But folks around here say they're tied to whatever's haunting that place. Some kind of curse." Dan's stomach churned. "A curse?" Joe's eyes darkened. "Whatever it is, it doesn't let go easily. If your daughter's been near that playground, you need to keep her away. And pray it hasn't marked her." Dan froze, his mind flashing to the way Emily had been tugging at her sleeve. That evening, Emily sat in her room, staring at her sketchpad. The drawing of the playground and the shadow seemed different now, more vivid, as though it had come to life. Her fingers hovered over the page, tracing the lines of the shadow's face. She could still hear its voice, soft and beckoning, in the back of her mind. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. "Emily?" Dan's voice called. "Can I come in?" She quickly closed the sketchpad and hid it under her bed. "Yeah." Dan entered, his expression serious. He sat on the edge of her bed, studying her. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "Sweetheart, if something's bothering you, you can tell me. I just want to help." Finally, she nodded. Slowly, she rolled up her sleeve, revealing the faint handprint on her arm. Dan's face paled. "It won't go away," Emily whispered. "And I think it wants me to come back." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Dan and Lisa sat down to discuss what they'd learned. "She's marked," Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "What does that even mean? What do we do?" "I don't know," Dan admitted. "But I'm not letting this thing take her." "We should leave," Lisa said desperately. "Pack up and go. Get as far away from here as we can." "And if it follows us?" Dan asked. "Joe said the curse doesn't let go easily." Lisa covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Dan reached out, gripping her arm. "We'll figure this out. But first, I need to see that playground for myself." "Dan, no," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "I have to," he said firmly. "If I don't, we'll never understand what we're dealing with." As the clock struck midnight, Dan stood at the edge of the woods, a flashlight in hand. The air was thick and still, the usual night sounds eerily absent. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the darkness. The path wound through the trees, each step heavier than the last. When the playground came into view, a chill ran down his spine. It was just as Emily had described, silent, yet somehow alive. Dan scanned the area, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The swings creaked softly, though there was no wind. The merry-go-round tilted slightly, as if waiting for someone to spin it. Then he saw it. In the sandbox, carved deep into the dirt, were the same strange symbols Joe had described. And standing just beyond the slide was the shadow. "Why are you here?" a hollow voice whispered, sending ice through Dan's veins. The flashlight flickered, and the laughter began. Dan's flashlight sputtered and died, plunging the playground into darkness. The laughter surged around him, a ghostly cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" Dan demanded, his voice trembling. He fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it in frustration. The shadow didn't answer. It merely stood there, tall and imposing, its indistinct edges blurring into the night. Then it moved. Dan froze as the figure advanced, its steps eerily silent despite the crunch of leaves under his own feet. The oppressive air grew colder with each passing moment, chilling him to the bone. "Stay back!" he yelled, his voice cracking. He reached into his pocket, clutching the small utility knife he had brought along. It was a pitiful defense, but it was all he had. The laughter faded into whispers. "You don't belong here," they hissed, circling him like an unseen wind. Dan felt a presence brush past him, though nothing was there when he turned. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to stay rooted, his eyes locked on the shadow. "What do you want?" he managed to say. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering his question. Then, in a voice that echoed with layers of otherworldly tones, it replied, "They are ours. Leave or be taken." The flashlight flickered back to life, its feeble beam illuminating the playground once more. Dan's gaze darted to the symbols in the sandbox. Jagged, looping lines that seemed to pulse faintly, almost alive. He dropped to his knees, examining them closer. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, though one he couldn't decipher. The edges glistened with an unnatural sheen, as if the markings had been burned into the earth itself. "What are these?" he muttered aloud. "They bind," the voice whispered, so close it felt like it was in his ear. Dan whipped around, but the shadow was gone. The air seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. For a brief moment the playground was still. Then the laughter returned, louder than before. Dan stumbled back, heart pounding. He didn't need to be told twice, he had to get out of there. As Dan sprinted through the woods, the laughter followed him, growing distorted and shrill. The flashlight bobbed wildly, casting disorienting shadows on the trees. He stumbled over a root, barely catching himself before he fell. Come on, he muttered, willing himself to keep moving. When he finally burst out of the woods and into the backyard, he doubled over, gasping for breath. The house loomed before him, a beacon of safety, but even here, the unease lingered. Dan slammed the back door shut and locked it, leaning against it as his mind raced. Whatever was happening at that playground, it was more than just ghost stories. And his family was in the middle of it. Lisa found him in the kitchen, hunched over the table with the flashlight and a piece of paper. He was sketching the symbols from memory, his hand trembling slightly. "Dan," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, then looked up at her with wide eyes. "We have to leave." Lisa frowned. "What happened out there?" "It's worse than I thought," Dan said. "There's something at that playground. Something dangerous. And those symbols." He gestured to the crude drawing he'd made. "They're part of it. They're keeping it there, but they're also feeding it." Lisa stared at him, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "Feeding it?" "Through the children," Dan said grimly. "It's taking them. Using them." Lisa covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "Emily, we're leaving tomorrow," Dan said firmly. "First thing. Upstairs." Emily sat on her bed, clutching her sketchpad. She had been listening through the floorboards, her father's words sinking into her like lead. The symbols, the children, the thing in the playground. It all made sense now. The dreams, the voices, the pull she felt every time she walked past those rusted swings. It wasn't just random. It was calling her. Her fingers traced the latest drawing she had made. The playground bathed in moonlight, with dark figures lurking in the shadows. It was so detailed, so vivid, that she couldn't remember drawing most of it. She closed the sketchpad and shoved it under her bed. She couldn't let her parents see it. That night, she didn't sleep. By sunrise, the family was packed and ready to leave. Dan loaded the last of their bags into the car while Lisa checked the house one last time. "Emily, come on," Lisa called from the front door. Emily hesitated, standing in her bedroom doorway. She glanced at the sketchpad under her bed, then at the window. The woods seemed so quiet now, almost peaceful. The pull was still there, faint but insistent. "Emily," Lisa called again. Emily grabbed her bag and hurried downstairs. The drive out of town was tense, the air in the car thick with unspoken fear. Dan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if expecting something to follow them. They were halfway down the highway when Emily spoke for the first time. "I don't think it's going to let us leave," she said softly. Dan's grip tightened on the wheel. It doesn't have a choice. But as the words left his mouth, the car began to sputter. The engine coughed violently, and the vehicle lurched forward before stalling completely. Dan cursed under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. "What's wrong?" Lisa asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Dan said, stepping out to check the engine. As he opened the hood, a cold wind swept through, carrying with it a faint, familiar sound. Laughter. Dan's heart sank as he turned toward the woods lining the highway. The trees stood still, but the laughter grew louder, echoing in the distance. Lisa stepped out of the car, clutching Emily's hand. "We have to go," she said urgently. "We can't leave the car here," Dan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We don't have a choice," Lisa snapped, pulling Emily closer. But Emily wasn't looking at her parents. Her gaze was fixed on the woods, her eyes wide and unblinking. "It wants us to come back," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Emily, stop," Lisa said, shaking her gently. Dan moved toward her, but before he could reach her, the woods erupted with sound. The laughter became deafening, joined by the creak of swings and the grinding of rusted metal. And then, through the trees, the shadow appeared. It was closer now, its form more defined. A tall, twisted figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through them. "Run!" Dan yelled, grabbing Lisa's arm. But Emily didn't move. "It's too late," she whispered. The shadow stretched out a hand, and the world seemed to tilt. Dan lunged for Emily, grabbing her arm just as the shadow's elongated hand reached through the trees. It stopped inches from her, the air around its fingers rippling like a heat wave. Emily's body tensed, her gaze locked on the shadow's hollow eyes. "It doesn't want us to leave," she whispered, her voice eerily detached. "We're not staying," Dan shouted, pulling her back toward the car. "Lisa, help me." Lisa, trembling but determined, grabbed Emily's other arm. Together, they dragged her to the vehicle as the shadow loomed closer, its movements slow but deliberate, as if savoring their fear. The laughter rang out again, high-pitched and childlike, but layered with something darker. Dan shoved Emily into the back seat and slammed the door. "Stay here," he barked, though his own voice trembled. He turned to Lisa. "Get in the car. Now." Lisa hesitated, her wide eyes darting between the shadow and the highway stretching endlessly in both directions. "Lisa!" Dan's shout snapped her back to reality, and she climbed into the passenger seat. Dan scrambled into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine groaned but refused to start. He tried again, harder this time, pumping the gas pedal. The laughter grew louder, accompanied by the creak of metal. Lisa glanced back at Emily, who sat unnervingly still, her hands clutching her sketchpad. "What's she drawing?" Lisa whispered. Dan didn't look back. "Focus on Emily. I'll get us out of here." But Lisa couldn't take her eyes off her daughter. Emily's pencil moved across the page with an unnatural speed, her face blank as if in a trance. "Emily," Lisa said softly, reaching out to her. The girl didn't respond. She finished the last stroke and held up the sketchpad. On the page was the shadow, its dark form perfectly rendered, looming over a car on the side of the road. Their car. Lisa's breath caught. "Dan!" she screamed. He looked up just as the shadow appeared directly in front of the car. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into him, and his body froze. The shadow raised one elongated finger, and the car began to shake. The air around them shimmered, and the highway dissolved into darkness. The world outside the car turned into a swirling void, the laughter echoing endlessly. "Dan!" Lisa shouted, gripping his arm. "Do something." "I'm trying," he yelled, frantically turning the key. Suddenly, the void parted like a curtain, revealing the playground. But it wasn't the same dilapidated place Dan had seen before. Now it was alive. The swings moved rhythmically, even though there was no wind. The merry-go-round spun on its own, and the slide glistened as if freshly polished. But everything was wrong. The equipment gleamed with an unnatural sheen, the colors too vibrant, too perfect, like a twisted imitation of a child's paradise. And scattered throughout the playground were figures. Children. They stood motionless, their faces blank and eyes hollow, like dolls waiting to be played with. "No," Dan whispered, his stomach turning. The shadow loomed closer, its form towering over the car. It reached out again, its long fingers curling around the hood. "Get out," Emily said suddenly, her voice commanding. Dan and Lisa turned to her, stunned. "What?" Dan asked. "Get out of the car," Emily repeated, her eyes locked on the shadow. "It won't hurt me if I go to it." "No," Lisa cried, grabbing her daughter's arm. "We're not letting you go." "You don't have a choice," Emily said, her voice unervingly calm. She opened the door and stepped out before they could stop her. "Emily!" Dan shouted, bolting out of the car. Lisa followed, but the moment they stepped onto the ground, an invisible force slammed into them, knocking them back. They landed hard, gasping for air. Dan tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. Emily walked toward the playground, her steps slow but steady. The shadow followed her, its movements fluid, almost graceful. The children on the playground turned their heads in unison, their hollow eyes watching Emily. "Please," Lisa sobbed, clawing at the ground as she tried to crawl forward. "Don't take her." Emily stopped at the edge of the sandbox, where the strange symbols glowed faintly. She looked back at her parents, her expression softening. "I have to," she said. "It's the only way to save you." "No," Dan shouted. "We'll find another way." But Emily shook her head. "You don't understand. It's already inside me. It's been there since the first time I stepped onto this playground." The shadow reached out, its hand hovering over Emily's head. Dan and Lisa screamed, but their voices were drowned out by the deafening laughter. Just as the shadow's fingers touched Emily, the symbols in the sandbox flared brightly, sending a shockwave through the playground. The shadow recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing shriek. The children on the playground collapsed like puppets with their strings cut. Emily turned to her parents, her eyes glowing faintly. "It's not over," she said. Before Dan or Lisa could respond, the shadow lunged at her, enveloping her in its darkness. And then, in an instant, both Emily and the shadow were gone. The laughter stopped. The playground was silent. Dan and Lisa sat in the car, the engine now inexplicably running. The highway stretched before them, ordinary and unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But Emily was gone. Lisa sobbed quietly, clutching the sketchpad Emily had left behind. Dan stared blankly at the road, his mind racing. "We'll find her," he said, his voice hollow. "Whatever it takes, we'll find her." Lisa didn't respond. She opened the sketchpad and froze. On the first page was a drawing of the playground, empty now except for a single figure standing in the sandbox. Emily. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth was curved into a slight, enigmatic smile. The days after Emily's disappearance passed in a haze for Dan and Lisa. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the sound of Lisa flipping through Emily's sketchpad over and over, searching for answers. Dan spent his nights pacing, phone in hand, calling every number he could think of. Police, local historians, even psychics. The responses were always the same. No leads, no answers. But one night, as he stared at the playground sketched in the pad, something clicked. "She's still there," Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa looked up, her face pale and drawn. "What do you mean?" "The sketchpad," Dan said, pointing to the latest drawing. "It's showing us where she is. Look at the sandbox." "It's different." Lisa leaned closer. The sandbox in the picture seemed deeper, almost as if it led somewhere underground. "It's a door," Dan said, his voice trembling. "A door to wherever she is, armed with flashlights, a crowbar, and the faint hope of finding Emily." Dan and Lisa returned to the playground in the dead of night. The swings hung still, the slide gleamed under the moonlight, and the sandbox. Dan's heart sank. The symbols were gone. "It's just a sandbox," Lisa said, her voice cracking. "No," Dan insisted, dropping to his knees. He began digging furiously with his hands, tossing sand aside. "It's here. I know it's here." Lisa watched in silence, her hands clutched tightly around the flashlight. After what felt like an eternity, Dan's fingers hit something solid. He cleared away the sand to reveal a wooden hatch, its edges carved with faint, glowing symbols. "I told you," he said, looking up at Lisa. She nodded, swallowing hard. Let's get her back. The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A foul, damp smell wafted up, making Lisa gag. Dan descended first, gripping the crowbar tightly. Lisa followed, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture. Strange markings covered them, pulsing faintly as if alive. What is this place? Lisa whispered. I don't know, Dan said, his voice echoing eerily. But it's been here a long time. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the sound of faint whispers began to surround them. She's close, Lisa said, clutching Dan's arm. Dan nodded, his jaw set. We keep moving. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a vast underground chamber. At its center was a towering structure that resembled a twisted version of the playground above. The swings moved on their own, the merry-go-round spun lazily, and a faint glow emanated from the sandbox at the center. Dan and Lisa exchanged a look before stepping into the chamber. Emily, Lisa called, her voice echoing off the walls. No response. Dan approached the sandbox cautiously. The symbols etched into its edges glowed brighter as he neared. She's here, he said. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath them trembled. Figures emerged from the shadows, children, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes on invisible strings. Lisa gasped, clutching Dan's arm. They're the missing kids. Dan's grip on the crowbar tightened. They're not kids anymore. The children moved closer, their heads tilting unnaturally as they surveyed Dan and Lisa. One of them, a small boy with a tear-streaked face frozen in an eternal expression of sorrow, spoke. You shouldn't be here. We're here for Emily, Dan said firmly. The boy tilted his head further. She belongs to the master now. Lisa stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. She's our daughter. We're taking her home. The boy smiled, a chilling, unnatural grin. The master is home. As the children closed in, the sandbox began to glow brighter. The symbols on its edges twisted and reformed, and a dark figure began to rise from within. The shadow. Dan stepped in front of Lisa, holding the crowbar like a shield. You won't take us, he said through gritted teeth. The shadow's hollow eyes focused on him. You brought yourselves here, it said, its voice a cacophony of whispers. You cannot leave. Lisa's flashlight flickered, and she turned toward the sandbox. Inside, she saw Emily, curled up and motionless, her face pale but peaceful. She's there, Lisa screamed. Dan, she's in the sandbox. Dan swung the crowbar at the nearest child, forcing his way toward the glowing pit. The children stumbled back but quickly regrouped, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. Keep them off me, Dan shouted as he dropped to his knees and began pulling at Emily's limp form. The shadow loomed over Lisa, its elongated fingers reaching toward her. You cannot take her, it said. She is part of me now. Lisa stood her ground, her heart pounding. Then take me instead, she said. The shadow paused, its hollow eyes narrowing. You would offer yourself in her place? Lisa's voice wavered, but she nodded. Just let her go. No, Dan yelled, pulling Emily free from the sandbox. The ground trembled violently, and the shadow let out a deafening roar. You defy the master's will. Lisa grabbed Emily from Dan and shoved her toward the staircase. Run. Both of you. Dan hesitated, but the look in Lisa's eyes left no room for argument. He grabbed Emily and sprinted for the stairs. Lisa turned to face the shadow, her hands trembling but her resolve unshaken. You want someone? Take me, she said again. The shadow hesitated, its form flickering. Then it lunged, enveloping Lisa in darkness. Dan reached the top of the stairs just as the hatch slammed shut behind him. Lisa, he screamed, pounding on the wood, but there was no response. The playground above was silent, the laughter gone. The swings hung lifeless, and the air was still. Dan collapsed to his knees, clutching Emily tightly as tears streamed down his face. We'll come back for her, he whispered. Emily stirred in his arms, her voice weak but clear. "She's still with us," she said. Dan looked down at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Emily's eyes glowed faintly, and she smiled. "The shadow doesn't take. It binds." The world above the playground was quiet and still, but for Dan, it felt like a storm raged inside him. He cradled Emily as she stirred, her body weak but warm, and her cryptic words echoed in his mind. "The shadow doesn't take. It binds." Dan stared at the hatch, now sealed and silent. Lisa was gone, but he could feel her presence, like a faint pulse in the air around him. "Emily," he said softly, brushing her hair from her face. "What did you mean? What's happening to your mom?" Emily's glowing eyes dimmed slightly as she tried to sit up. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "She's part of it now. Like they were." Dan's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" "Part of what?" "The playground," Emily said. "It's alive. It's not just a place. It's the master's heart." Dan couldn't process the weight of Emily's words. The master, the heart, Lisa trapped beneath the earth. None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving without her. He glanced at the hatch again. The symbols were no longer glowing, but their faint outlines remained etched into the wood. "Stay here," he told Emily, setting her gently on the bench. "No," she said, clutching his arm. "You can't go back down there. It'll take you too." "I'm not leaving your mom," Dan said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Emily's glowing eyes filled with tears. "If you go, it won't let you come back." Dan hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. But then he thought of Lisa, her last words, her unwavering courage as she faced the shadow alone. "I don't care," he said. "I have to try." Dan grabbed the crowbar and wedged it under the edge of the hatch. It resisted at first, but with a grunt, he pried it open. The staircase below was darker than before, the faint whispers replaced by an ominous hum. He turned to Emily. "Stay on the bench. No matter what happens, don't come down here." Emily nodded reluctantly, clutching the sketchpad to her chest. Dan descended into the darkness, his flashlight flickering as if the air itself resisted the light. The staircase seemed longer this time, twisting endlessly downward. The air grew colder with every step, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through his chest. When Dan reached the bottom, the chamber was different. The twisted playground was gone, replaced by a sprawling expanse of black, viscous shadows. The ground beneath his feet pulsed like a heartbeat, and the air was heavy with an oppressive energy. "Lisa," he called out, his voice swallowed by the void. The shadows shifted, parting to reveal a figure. Lisa. She stood at the center of the expanse, her face serene but her eyes glowing faintly, just like Emily's. She didn't move or respond to Dan's voice. "Lisa," he shouted again, running toward her. But as he neared, the shadows coalesced, forming a barrier between them. A voice emerged from the darkness, deep and resonant. "She is ours now." The shadows swirled, taking shape. A towering figure emerged, its form shifting and flickering as if it were made of smoke and fire. Its hollow eyes glowed with an intense light, and its voice reverberated through the chamber. "You defy me, mortal," it said. She chose her fate. "Do not interfere." Dan tightened his grip on the crowbar, his knuckles white. "She didn't choose anything. You tricked her." The master laughed, a chilling sound that echoed endlessly. It was her love that bound her here. A love so strong. She offered herself willingly. Dan's chest heaved with rage. "Then take me instead. Let her go." The master tilted its head, considering him. "A noble offer. But she is already one with me. To take her place would mean to destroy her." Dan faltered, his resolve wavering. "I won't leave without her," he said, his voice trembling. The master extended a hand, its fingers long and sharp like blades. "Then you shall join her." As the shadows closed in, Dan felt a sudden warmth behind him. "Stop!" Emily's voice rang out, strong and commanding. Dan turned to see her standing at the edge of the chamber, her small frame silhouetted against the darkness. The sketchpad in her hands glowed with a bright, golden light. The master recoiled, its form flickering. "What is this?" it hissed. Emily stepped forward, holding the sketchpad high. "You don't own her. You don't own any of them." The light from the sketchpad intensified, illuminating the chamber. The shadows writhed and shrieked as the glow grew brighter. Lisa's form shimmered, her glowing eyes dimming as she looked at Dan with sudden clarity. "Dan," she said, her voice weak but filled with emotion. "You came for me." The master let out a deafening roar. "Enough! You cannot undo my will." Emily ignored it, her focus on the sketchpad. She began to draw, her pencil moving furiously across the page. The chamber around them shifted, the shadows dissolving into light. The master's form began to fracture, its hollow eyes widening in fury. "No," it screamed. "You cannot destroy me." Emily finished her drawing and held it up. The sketch depicted the playground above, empty and peaceful, the shadows gone. The light from the sketchpad erupted, engulfing the chamber. Dan reached for Lisa, pulling her close as the world around them dissolved into blinding brilliance. When Dan opened his eyes, he was back on the playground. The sky was a soft gray, the early morning light filtering through the trees. Lisa lay beside him, her eyes closed but her breathing steady. Emily sat nearby, clutching the sketchpad to her chest, her face pale but determined. "Emily," Dan said, crawling toward her. "Are you okay?" She nodded slowly. "It's over. The master is gone." Dan turned to Lisa, gently shaking her. Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled weakly. "You saved me," she whispered. Dan pulled her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down his face. As they stood together, the playground seemed to shimmer. The rusted swings glinted in the light, the slide creaked softly, and the sandbox, the symbols were gone. Emily looked at her parents, her eyes clear and bright. "We can go home now." Dan and Lisa exchanged a glance, then took her hands. Together, they walked away from the playground, leaving its sinister history behind. But as they reached the car, Emily paused, looking back one last time. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing by the swings, a faint, shadowy outline. Then it was gone.